through geographic space. But now, without further ado, with that preliminary introduction, I'd like to pass to our panelists, and I'm going to be fascinated to hear their thoughts on this role of transport infrastructure in promoting access to economic opportunity. So I'm going to begin first with Peter, before moving to Myra, and then turning to Nick, and then finally turning to Stephanie. And so Peter, handing over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. It is a pleasure to be here. Stephen, Ed, Jim, thank you so much for organizing this very fruitful partnership between the Department of Transportation and the NBER. As Stephen mentioned, my name is Peter Blair. I'm an assistant professor at Harvard University and a research associate at the NBER in the education group. So while a lot of my work focuses on the link between labor markets and educational markets, I was actually trained at the Wharton School as an urban economist. And an important through line in a lot of my work is this notion of racial equality. So I want to talk, as we think today about access to transportation infrastructure and economic opportunity, about the ways in which the use and the design of transportation infrastructure has historically contributed to racial inequality. And I also want to point to some key design ideas and principles that both researchers and policymakers can consider as ways of redeeming the role that transportation infrastructure can play in promoting broad-based opportunity. The market is the key organizing mechanism in economics for the efficient allocation of goods and services. And a key function of transportation infrastructure is to improve the efficiency and the functioning of the market, both in terms of bringing goods and services to market more quickly and at a cheaper cost. In a pioneering study, Dave Donaldson and Rick Hornbeck show that railroads in the US contributed to about 3.4% of GNP by 1890. When viewed through the lens of race, however, transportation infrastructure has a very painful past. The ships used by enslavers to transport human cargo from the west coast of Africa to the New World was the first encounter that many African Americans had with transportation infrastructure in the US. Work by Elora de Renacourt, Nathan Nunn, and Leonard Wanchicon show that the trade in human cargo enriched European port cities while sowing seeds of mistrust in institutions critical for economic development in Africa. Once transported to the US, enslaved Blacks were made to construct railroads in the American South to transport yet another fruit of their labor, cotton. Rather than working for them, transportation worked upon them, deepening existing economic inequality and the theft of personal liberty. Historian Theodore Kornweibel estimates that more than 75% of railroad companies in the US use some level of enslaved labor. The use of unfree labor continued in the construction of our very impressive highway systems, as noted by Conrad Miller. Legendary singer Sam Cooke's hit Chain Gang song draws inspiration from him observing a group of imprisoned men building a stretch of highway. That's the sound of the men working on the chain gang. That song. The Federal Highway Act of 1956, which highly subsidized the creation of interstate highways, was used in some instances to reinforce disappearing red lines that legally segregated neighborhoods by race and decimated fledgling minority enclaves in major US cities. Legal scholar Deborah Archer notes that the establishment of I-94 impacted 15% of the Black population in St. Paul, Minneapolis. The specter of highway construction still haunts minority communities today. My former student and co-author, Kenneth Whaley, who's on the market this year, has written an economic analysis highlighting the potential harms of a current proposal in Texas to build an extension of I-45 that would cut through the predominantly minority communities of Gulfgate, South Union, and Dixie Drive in order to connect the predominantly white suburbs of Pearland and Alvin to Houston. Because transportation infrastructure affects our daily lives, it's no surprise that opposition to racial discrimination in public transportation, notably the Montgomery busing system, catalyzed a year-long boycott that resulted in the emergence of civil rights icon Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. The resulting Supreme Court decision desegregating public transportation would pave the way for the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which itself would predate the establishment of the Department of Transportation in 1966 by President Lyndon Johnson. An accurate understanding of access to transportation infrastructure and economic opportunity requires a thorough understanding of the experiences of Black Americans with transportation infrastructure. A transportation infrastructure that works to improve access and economic opportunity for a group of Americans who have historically been denied both is a litmus test for our transportation infrastructure's broad-based utility. Quantifying the historical debt owed to African Americans due to the historical lack of access is a critical first step in establishing how truly monumental this task is. This will require work in the spirit of Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mueller's accounting of the racial wealth gap. As history shows, transportation policy, moreover, interacts very deeply with housing, education, and labor market policy. In fact, the size of transportation investment multipliers will rely crucially on research and policy coordination that integrates across these three areas. Finally, given the general equilibrium impacts of transportation infrastructure on policy, given the general equilibrium impacts of transportation infrastructure policy on spatial economics, there's value in considering the efficacy of linking transportation infrastructure investments with places that have spatial permanence within minority communities. For example, historically Black colleges and universities. I'm looking forward to the panel discussion and to your questions.
Thanks very much, Peter. Thanks for that terrific start to the panel. And I'd like to pass now to Myra, who's going to talk next. If you could, Myra, you should be able to share your screen now.
Do you see my slides?
Yes, and we hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. So my name is Myra. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for this conference. It's great to be part of this panel. I'll start with some general observation, building on existing literature, and then talk a bit about my research on this. So there's a spatial dimension to economic opportunities that translate into inequality and social mobility. And it's been shown that there are stark differences between social mobility across countries, regions, cities, and even down to the zip code level. Moreover, place, economic backgrounds, and economic opportunities intersect in important ways. So for instance, cities with more segregation or those with larger Black population tend to show a weaker upward mobility pattern. So transport infrastructure can really play an important role on the economic opportunity of individuals by either connecting residents to better job opportunities further away or by creating better options locally. So there's significant evidence across countries that lower income population tend to suffer from restricted transport options. Poor access to transport options can limit access to jobs, educational institutions, health facilities, which in turn can lead to poverty traps. So as Steve mentioned at the beginning, one of the key challenges when evaluating the effect of transport infrastructure is really the effect that these effects can be heterogeneous. So it's important to understand individual responses to access to transport infrastructure. It's also important to understand the long run effects. So better access to transport infrastructure has the potential to break the link between parents' economic status and the children's outcome, and so increase social mobility. However, empirically, studying individual responses on long run outcomes is challenging. So one needs a large scale infrastructure that occurred sufficiently far back in time in order to measure long run effects. So in one of my projects, I looked at a historical setting. I empirically assessed the long run individual level effects of access to transport infrastructure. Specifically, I explored the expansion of the railway network in 19th century England and Wales, and to estimate how better access to the to the railway network affected social mobility. So this historical setting is well suited for this question for at least three reasons. One is that a lot of research on the Industrial Revolution point to the steam engine as revolution in technology. It provided transport of freight and passengers more quickly and cheaply than ever before, and brought new opportunities to town. Second, Britain was the first nation to develop the railway. And so between 1825 and 1914, all major cities were connected, and there was 20,000 miles of worth of track. So here I'm showing you the expansion between 1851 and 1881. And then finally, there was Britain has really a rich historical census data, and thanks to advances in like digitalization and new tools and text analysis, we can now process large-scale data more effectively, and therefore can have access to individual record and locate individuals down to the street level through the address that they provide in their census records. So we can now explore new spatial dimension and social mobility patterns. So here I'm showing you a map of England and Wales. And you see here, I'm plotting the share of sons who work in a different occupation than their father by parish. Colors represent the quartile of this measure of social mobility, with red representing high mobility and blue low mobility. And not only is there a lot of like variation spatially, but also these effects are really highly localized. So I'm just going to zoom in here on the Liverpool to Manchester line. And here I've added black lines for the train lines. And so in this paper, what I do is I estimate the effect of growing up 5K or like 1 hour's walk closer to the nearest train station on father and son's occupational tie. And so 3 key insights that come out of this project is that first, better access to the railway network led to significant changes in social mobility. Comparing sons who grew up next to the train station and those that lived 1 hour's walk away, better connected sons were 6 percentage points more likely to work in a different occupation than their father, and 5 percentage points more likely to be upward mobile. So when designing infrastructure location and assessing cost benefits, it's important to bear in mind that these effects can be long lasting and highly localized. Secondly, we find that better access does not benefit everybody equally. So the effects are really multidimensional. Better access to the railway network benefiting sons from upper and bottom income families, while middle class sons were more likely to move both up and down in the occupational ranking. So transport infrastructure can really have large distributional consequences, and without careful consideration, you can unintentionally exacerbate pre-existing inequalities. And then finally, when decomposing the various channels at work, we find that the majority of the effect really comes from local opportunities coming to town rather than people leaving. So think of new industries demanding new skills being local now. So of course, England and Wales during the Industrial Revolution is a very different setting, time and place than today. So you have to be mindful of the external validity of historical studies. But I still think that our results highlight important conceptual issues of highly localized, long-lasting heterogeneous effects by economic background, and it's still likely to play a role today and need to be further understood. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Myra. That's fascinating, and that evidence over long-run horizons of these heterogeneous effects is going to connect nicely, I think, with Nick's presentation later. Just following now, so if you could stop sharing your screen.
Of course.
Thanks, and then we'll pass over to Nick for him to continue.
Yeah, can you see this, Steve?
Yeah, that looks great. We can also hear you perfectly.
Great. So thanks very much to Steve and Jim and the rest of the organizers for inviting me to talk today. My name is Nick Tsivanidis. I'm an assistant professor at Berkeley, and I'm going to talk to you today briefly about one of my projects on the aggregate and distributional impacts of transit infrastructure, moving to a different setting, looking at a system that was built in Bogota in Colombia. Okay, so let's kind of think of the thought exercise where a new transit system is being built in a city, and we want to value the gains that come from that system. So one approach that's quite popular amongst policymakers is to look at the value of travel time saved. Right, so this is kind of the direct effect of the transit improvement. So it previously takes me half an hour to go from A to B. Now it takes me 20 minutes. So the value to me would be those 10 minutes times the value that I place on that time. But there's also going to be a host of kind of indirect effects that Steve spoke about. People might change what transit mode they use to get to and from work. Firms and workers might respond by changing where they want to live and work or where they want to set up shop. And then in equilibrium, wages and house prices may also react, and these things are all going to be solved for together in one kind of feedback loop. And so when we think about the total impact of the transit infrastructure, it's of course going to be the sum of all of these forces. And so the question kind of underlying my research project was, you know, how important are these indirect versus the direct effects? And ultimately, you know, do they really matter for policymakers? Do they really change our understanding of who wins or loses, or how big the return is to a particular investment? So to make things concrete, for example, in Bogota, I'm going to be looking at the difference across the rich and poor, and the poor rely on public transit. And so we should think that they might gain the most from new transit due to these direct effects, given that they use it the most. But it's unclear once we consider these equilibrium forces, how that would affect the answer. So in this project, I'm going to evaluate the impact of Transmilenio, which is the world's most used bus rapid transit system, built in Bogota during the 2000s. You know, you can see a little bit from this picture, but you can really think of it as operating in large ways like a subway, but they're a lot faster and a lot cheaper to build. And so it's becoming very popular in countries in the emerging world. And what I'm going to do is leverage very rich track level data that, you know, I had the luck of having access to in Colombia, to both assess whether a quantitative spatial model can fit the, you know, the real world change in city structure observed before and after the period that the system was built, and then also use that to quantify both the aggregate and distributional effects across the rich and poor of this system, and compare those with the answers that one would get if you focused only on this value of travel time savings approach. And I wanted to organize my my kind of talk into 3 key insights that I think you know, policymakers might be able to take away from my research. And the first insight is really the importance, you know, the value of data, both to tell us about how the world works and how different groups of workers might be affected by different policies, but also then in order to fit and run these kind of quantitative models that might allow us to trace out these distributional effects of new infrastructure. So in my model, you know, one of the results of my model is that the transit network matters insofar as it affects workers' accessibility to well-paid jobs, which is this figure on the left, and how it affects firms' access to workers, which is this figure on the right. And so, you know, in my case, I had this rich track level data, so I was able to compute these measures actually for different groups of workers as well. So if we're interested in, you know, computing how transit networks might affect different groups of workers according to race or according to gender, then it's really important to make this sort of data available according to those disaggregations and put them in the hands of, you know, academic researchers, but also practitioners who can use these models. One of the you know, implications of the model is that there should be a log linear relationship between changes in accessibility induced by this new transit network and a host of outcomes, including floor space prices, populations, and employment. And I was able to use this rich data to show that this, you know, these relationships are indeed borne out in the data. I was able to then look at you know, how this affected different groups, and what I found. Different groups according to their skills. So I'm looking at comparing high impacts on high versus low skilled workers. What I found was that commute location choices of the low skilled were much more responsive to changes in travel times induced by this new transit network than the high skilled. And this is even you know, accounting for the fact that they use public transit more. So, you know, what's the main takeaway here? It's that high skilled worker choices are much stickier in you know, with respect to travel times than choices of the low skilled, and this, you know, sensitivity is going to be an important parameter that determines the incidence of who really benefits from transit infrastructure. I was able to then also look at how you know, this system affected gentrification, and I found that it did increase the college share of neighborhoods, but only in neighborhoods that were surrounded by a sufficiently high number of college workers in the initial period. And so the kind of intuition that comes out from the model about this is that the rich care not only about accessibility, but also about amenities, quality of schools, safety, access to parks, bars and restaurants. And the willingness to pay for improved accessibility is higher in these high amenity neighborhoods. And so one of the implications of this is that, you know, a slum is unlikely to gentrify from a new transit line because it lacks all of these other amenities that the rich value. But a middle-income neighborhood may be you know, much more likely to gentrify because it either has some of these amenities or it has the kind of foundation for them to be constructed over the coming period. I'm almost, and I have two more slides, Steve. So the second insight is that these equilibrium responses matter. So I find that the aggregate gains are around 26% higher after I account for all of this reallocation of economic activity and equilibrium responses of prices, and that they actually really matter for distributional consequences. So I actually find that, you know, while under this value of time savings approach, the low skilled gain more than the high, that answer was actually reversed once we consider all of this reallocation and equilibrium responses of prices. And in large part, this is due to these differing elasticities of substitution across commutes that I showed you earlier. The final insight is that, you know, I use the model to then assess whether there's an interaction of transit with related land use policies. And so in Bogota, there was this very big change in transit policy without any complementary change in zoning laws. So what I was able to establish in the data is that there was no significant response in housing supply to this new network, despite very large responsive prices. So what I did is I simulated the impact of what's called a development air rights sale, where the government sells permits to build at higher densities near stations. And this has been used to great success in a number of Asian cities, both to finance the construction of transit, as well as to increase the housing supply. And what I found was that the average, you know, welfare gain under one candidate policy would have been around 20% higher, you know, given the same network being built. And that this, you know, benefited the low skilled the most because it tended to attenuate the price increases in the neighborhoods where they were living. So I'll stop there because I think I've already gone over time, but thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Nick. Really interesting to see that role of indirect effects in shaping the distributional consequences of the change in transport infrastructure. That's really interesting. And then finally, turning to Stephanie, who's going to speak next.
Great, thank you for the introduction. I'm thrilled to be on the panel today to talk about investment in transportation and opportunities. My name is Stephanie Lawrence. I'm the Chief Economist at the Bureau of Transportation Statistics at the Department of Transportation. And I wanted to thank NBER on bringing us together today for this panel, but also for the entire day. It's been a lot of super interesting conversations and things that I think will be really valuable to the department and how we think through the next 5 years of transportation. You know, equity is top of mind in the current administration. We've had several executive orders that directly deal with equity or indirectly deal with equity. And so it's starting to filter into so many different conversations that we are having. And, you know, we really need to get back to data and statistics and to be able to justify some of the decisions that we want to make so they can hold up over time and be beneficial over time. We know that transportation decisions always have equity implications. We also know the average household, the cost of transportation is the second highest expense next to housing. And so that can have really dramatic impacts, especially for low-income households. We also see data that shows low-income households are more likely to have longer commute times and experience more crashes. They're also more exposed to bad air quality. And these are all sort of secondary, thirdary effects of how we've designed and invested in our transportation system. You know, as Stephen alluded to in the opening remarks, we've seen racism built explicitly into our infrastructure, you know, where highways have gone through hearts of Black neighborhoods. We see communities that don't have a whole lot of transit access and aren't served by the private companies like Lyft and Uber, and sort of left out of the access to amenities, even just simple amenities like grocery stores, education, healthcare. We find that a lot of people can be surprised by these facts or sort of negate their importance. Maybe they're small or insignificant in the grand scheme of things. And it sort of really reiterates why this research is so incredibly important for us to go back and say, no, like, let's look at the numbers. Let's look at how different access has affected different communities, how, you know, our past policies, regulations, decisions have had direct consequences on the system that we are perpetuating. I spent some time this week taking a deep dive into Nick and Myra's papers. It was super interesting. And, you know, when I was reading them, I immediately thought to a current policy proposal that came out of one of the executive orders actually relating to climate change, but coming back to equity. And this program is called Justice 40. And so what this program is saying is that it wants to direct the federal government to direct 40% of benefits from climate and clean infrastructure investments to underserved, overburdened, or disadvantaged communities. Well, from an economist perspective, this better raise a lot of red flags in your head because it's artificially saying where these benefits should be going. From a policy perspective, you can see the intention. We want to make sure that as we advance and progress the system, we aren't leaving anyone behind. How do we meet those two things together to create policy that both recognizes our past, but kind of honors the system, the philosophy, what we know, and kind of the economic reckoning of things. So I'll give a little details on Justice 40. I'm happy to talk about it later. But essentially for DOT, it's going to cover roughly 20 programs. They include all sorts of modes: transit, highway, rail, port. We see it in programs that are massive infrastructure investments to on-the-job training and workforce development. And so these investments are going to have very different impacts across the transportation system and for very different communities. What are the equity considerations for a port versus a freight railroad versus a highway construction? They're all very different, and then transit and other pieces there. So many of our programs, we require a benefit cost application to understand the net benefits of these proposed projects. And in general, we typically capture safety, travel time, and emissions, and we're kind of agnostic to the distributional benefits. We look at kind of MPO areas or communities or sort of where the project is located. And we don't really have a framework to think about this Justice 40 equation. How do we assign 40% of these benefits to certain populations? And there's some thought that maybe this isn't within the economic modeling landscape, although it's using the economic language. And so how do we also kind of rectify those two ideas that we're talking about benefits, maybe not in the traditional economic sense, but still very important into how we shape and define our policies. So Nick's paper had some really great things that we've been thinking through at the department, and kind of where you draw the lines on what benefits to include. So we saw the first order benefits of travel time savings that predominantly benefited the low income workers. That's great from an equity perspective. That's where we want to invest, transit opportunities. When we look at the bigger scope, we then see the kind of gentrification results and the higher property values, higher wages that went to the already high earning incomes. So as we're thinking through implementing a program like Justice 40, where do we draw those lines? How do we make sure that our investments, maybe with the intention of favoring an underserved population, doesn't actually benefit, people that aren't necessarily needed to benefit from that investment? It's kind of not an arbitrary line, but there needs to be some lines in some places that we need to draw. I also thought through Myra's paper, which was something we think about a lot in terms of programs where we don't think a lot, or we haven't historically thought a lot about the distributional impacts. And so, thinking about the train system and seeing that, it kind of benefited the high-skilled laborers and the low-skilled laborers. Well, in the Justice 40 framework, that also falls apart because if we want to prioritize low-skilled workers, but it benefits everyone, is that a bad policy? And, I think the answer is no, but, maybe it doesn't fall in that 40-60 paradigm. And how do we make sure we have good policies that help our targeted audience and can also help other people, and kind of finding that line in that perspective? If you think about the Justice 40 framework, it would, let's say we're building this historical railroad, obviously we wouldn't target only the sort of lower skilled jobs because the railroad is connecting people to higher skilled jobs. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't generate the same level of benefits if you tried to only invest in communities that were in that lower skilled category. The whole point is that you're connecting to higher skilled jobs. And so how do you balance that your policies are also going to benefit other communities that might be not of your target? We're thinking through these things a lot because, we want to create a framework that's going to apply to multiple different modes. We want to make sure it doesn't have any unintended consequences as well. That's definitely a concern that we're thinking through. As we've been talking, we heard it in kind of the opening remarks of this entire day, there is a historic infrastructure bill that is being voted in Congress right now that is going to increase funding in ways we just haven't seen or experienced. Just in some numbers, since I know we're all numbers people, our current authorization is $305 billion. The proposed authorization is $550 billion. And it's some of the biggest ever federal investment in public transportation. It's, you know, some of the biggest investment in passenger rail we've seen since the onset of Amtrak. There's also a program that we've never seen before, or we've never sort of done before, but it's to specifically rectify some of the wrongs that have been perpetuated by transportation decisions. So there is a program currently that is to fund the reconnection of neighborhoods that have been divided by highways. And so how do we sort of implement and go through there? You know, we have this historic opportunity to address the infrastructure backlog in this country and expand the network and our transportation services in a really real and meaningful way. But connecting back to what Peter was saying, we also have an obligation of the department to invest in transportation in a way that doesn't perpetuate the historical racial harm that has already occurred, or create new ones and sort of unintended consequences as we roll out some programs on scales we just haven't seen before. You know, done right, transportation investments have the potential to be a tremendous tool for advancing equity and creating jobs and promoting growth. However, it can be done wrong, and we know it can be done wrong. I'm really excited for this research to better understand both these kind of good and bad consequences, to understand it in the purview of kind of an economic modeling system, and, you know, to support the decision makers of our leadership to make the most informed decisions. All right, so that's everything I have.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you. That was wonderful. And I'd just like to thank all of the panelists for this really terrific discussion, raising these sort of absolutely fundamental questions about measuring and understanding the impact of transport infrastructure on access to economic opportunity and its distributional consequences by race, by income, and by different categories. We don't have too much time as we want to end on time, and I know there's been some comments in the chat already, but I know Jim has a question that I'd like to ask him.
Yes, so Stephanie, thank you for teeing up the Justice 40 issues. And just to give you a sense of, you know, how this is permeating out from DOT and from Washington, I have had through the NBER network, researchers contacting me in connection with this project and saying, do you have any advice? We are getting questions from state administrators trying to administer, you know, federally funded programs and asking, what are the rules for Justice 40? How do we define a disadvantaged community? And things like that. So this is a longer question than you need to answer today. But I think that there is a community of researchers who are, you know, we are focusing these days on distributional effects and on measuring heterogeneity. And I think there's a need. Many people would be delighted to do calculations of the form. Here is the part of my cost benefit analysis, which falls to, quote, disadvantaged communities. But I think there's a little uncertainty at this point as to what those communities are and how you draw the lines to do that. So if there is anything, whether it is regulatory or proposed rulemaking or other things like that, you know, offline or in a chat somewhere, and if there's something that one could point to, I believe that there is an applied econ community which is kind of chomping at the bit to do something in this area and try to engage with this initiative. But I think there's a little bit more detail needed from the Justice 40 description to be able to do that. And that might be a helpful thing to put out there.
Yeah, well, so one thing I can say is in part of meeting the executive order, they've asked each agency to define what a disadvantaged community means, which it could be very different depending on who you are, you know, HUD versus transit versus EPA and others. And they have issued some guidance that is still, we feel the same way in the sense that we would have some firm definitions of how we do this, how we implement it. And over the next year, we're going to be working with OMB to create those standards on a department level. And hopefully we can do it across government-wide as well.
Great, thank you.
And then Zach, I think you have a question as well.
Yeah, I have a question for Stephanie as well. So, all this work on equity and transportation is really exciting. I wanted to ask a question about one specific provision. In particular, this relates to an earlier paper in a sense, but the value of time savings. So under current guidance, as I understand it, for airports where rich people primarily benefit, the value of time savings is like $65 an hour. For buses, where poor people benefit, it's like $25 an hour of valuing the savings. And since the time savings is like most important benefit, I would think this would tend to push money toward projects that benefit richer people. My questions are: one, like, am I understanding this correctly? And two, if so, are there initiatives to try to change this?
So I'm actually going to maybe punt this question. I think Darren Timothy is on the line, who is the chief economist of the entire department, and the sort of value of travel time settings falls under his purview. If he's signed off, then
I'm here, Stephanie.
Great. Do you want to speak to that, Darren?
Sure. Can have a longer conversation about our value time guidance. It is something we are looking forward to updating more comprehensively in the future. But you are correct. The value of time, travel time savings that we use for airline passengers is based on the fact, is a higher value based on the notion that airline passengers, tend to come from tend to have higher incomes. I don't think those values are really used in a way that would be valuing one type of investment more than another as a result. But it is something we've looked at in benefit cost analyses of, sometimes we've had applicants in different areas, come up with using different travel time savings value based on local wage rates, either higher or lower. And from from doing an actual demand forecast, of course, you would need to take account of what the actual wage rates are. For welfare analysis, I think our guidance going forward is going to be more prescriptive at using a uniform value of time, regardless of where the investment is located. But I would also, with regard to transit, we do value waiting time higher than we do in-vehicle time, which for a lot of transit-oriented improvements, that makes the values relatively higher. So.
Thanks very much, Stephanie and Darren. Thank you. And then we're almost out of time, but I see Peter has one last quick question.
Yeah, I wanted to Stephanie, thanks again for being here. My question is, what are some of the ways in which DOT is coordinating with the Department of Labor, the Department of Education, and other departments across the government as a way of trying to head off some of these general equilibrium implications that we see from Myra's work and from Nick's work? Because I think that that's going to be something that's really critical to the long-term success of these sorts of programs. So if you can speak a bit briefly towards that, and like, what are some research that we might be able to do as a community that could that could answer some questions that would be fundamental to creating the right sorts of partnerships across these different agencies within the government?
Yeah, I mean, I can say that it is a priority to strengthen the connections and sort of the overlap we have between the different agencies. I know there's a very strong desire to partner with HUD. If you think about land use and housing and transportation, we should be thinking about policies in a way that overlap on those two things. We're also sort of tapped into DOE and thinking about energy and EVs and how those policies are rolling out as well. I think it's important. I think we have work to do to strengthen some of those. What's difficult in these moments is, Justice 40 is a great example where we had, 60 days to come up with a framework that we're going to recommend for DOT. And that doesn't give us a lot of time to talk to our colleagues at HUD or other places. So we're hoping that we can kind of come along, that OMB can bring us all together, that we can kind of lean on the all of government approach that we've been talked about and kind of come together for these pieces.
And just one other tiny point too. If there's ways to identify institutions that have this spatial permanence, like HBCUs, and try to think about how can transportation policy interact with these institutions that have historically served the Black community, that could be very powerful. So I just want to put that on your radar.
Definitely.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks very much, Stephanie. We're essentially out of time now. I just wanted to say a big thank you again to everybody in the conference today for a terrific day showcasing this sort of fascinating research, really advancing the frontier for the economics of transportation in the 21st century. And to thank all the members of the panel this afternoon for a terrific discussion about this really important set of economic issues. And I just want to see, Jim, is there anything further that you'd like to say to close the conference?
I'm just going to thank first the researcher community, those of you who've been here, those of you who've been on YouTube. We've had up to 50 people on YouTube watching in addition to the Zoom crowd today. So this has been really exciting to see the interest and enthusiasm for this. And of course, I want to thank Steve and Ed Glazer, who've been co-organizing this, but especially the DOT team. And I know Stephanie is here, a number of other folks are here, but thank you for making time in your day. If you have suggestions or ideas of things that would be useful to see the research community trying to tackle, one of the things I like about this structure is it gives us a chance to have a two-way interaction, and there may be some valuable ways in which we can try to encourage research on particular topics. Tony Choi is the person at DOT who is in most contact with me. But of course, Robert Hampshire, who we're very grateful to, as the head of OSTR, has played a key role in supporting this initiative. And we are very hopeful that this will be able to continue. We have to work on that and work out some of the details. But if you have, for the DOT folks, if you have ideas or suggestions or comments, please use those channels as a way to link them through. And as I alluded to in my comment with Stephanie, there has been, people have noticed that we're doing transportation economics at the NBER, and that this is a high profile activity within the applied economics community. And it's been really exciting. And I think that there's a way to continue to leverage this so that those of you who are experienced hands in transportation can see an exciting new generation coming in to work on these topics, and so that generation can have a place, a venue in which this kind of interaction with policymakers as well as with experienced researchers can take place. So on that note, we will gather again next spring, probably sometime in early June, which has been our tradition. This is the fourth of our meetings that we've done in connection with this project, and we will certainly do another one next spring. So please be on the lookout for an announcement about that. We'll reach out to all of you at that time. But have a great day, a great weekend, and it's been great to see you all today. Thank you.